it clean now. What I mean now, it is H2O. Gotta have it. H2O. Everything needs it. Don't you know that H2O is the source of life?
Hello and welcome to EocAlert. I'm your host, Nadine Patrice, Executive Director of Operation Green Leaves. Our topic today is community water contamination, and I'm so pleased to have three special guests with me today to discuss the issue and find a lot of information what you can do at home to keep your family safe. So on my right, I have Martha Merson, who's the Project Director of Statistic for Action at TURC in Massachusetts. And I have my good friend Audrey Peterman, who's the president of Earthwise Production. Welcome, Audrey.
Thank you.
And Joseph Jean-Baptiste, who's also an expert in the field, and he worked for many, many years at the South Florida Water Management District. Welcome.
Thank you, thank you.
Today we'll be talking about our rivers, our streams, our lakes, and our creeks. And Audrey, I know you had some experience at the Norfolk on the New River.
I was introduced to the North Fork as a result of being married to the most wonderful man in the world, my husband, Frank Peterman. And Frank grew up in Dania, which is a little town just south of Fort Lauderdale. And at the time he grew up, he remembered the North Fork of the New River being a very verdant and beautiful place, the heart of the black community. Well, actually, I should establish that the North Fork runs through a historical black neighborhood in Fort Lauderdale.
Okay.
And its headwaters begin in the Everglades, and then it empties out all the way into the intracoastal. But at the point where it passes through the historical black neighborhood, it had become quite contaminated as a result of the city of Fort Lauderdale actually pumping waste into that water for a number of years, actually for 21 years, from 1962 to 1983.
Well, I didn't want to, did they know they were doing this, or? I know you're going to
know that they were doing this?
No, the city of Fort
As if, yes, they did know this. But let us just say that reflects a different time in our history when people had a perception that some people were less valuable than other people without seemingly any recognition of the fact that everything is connected. But anyway, to jump back to where I became involved, my husband Frank and I had established our company, Earthwise Productions, as a way of bringing information about the environment to African American communities around the country. And also, we were looking for ways that we could connect the African Americans and the environment to other mainstream environmental groups. So at that time, we discovered that there was the big push to restore the Everglades had just began. And we thought, how can we connect these communities with the restoration project and make them see how it is relevant to them? So the North Fork, being a part of the Everglades and being heavily bounded on either side by this historical black neighborhood, we felt, wow, if we can draw the people's attention back to the way the North Fork was back in the day when Frank was growing up, when, as I said, it was so verdant, it was so wonderful, it was where people congregated, then if we could make them remember that.
This is great.
Yes, if we could make them remember that, then it would really show them how they were connected to the bigger picture, and then we could get them engaged in trying to help restore it. I have to say, I found it was a very successful project, because what we did was link the people, the community, the business people in the community, the political leaders, many of whom had grown up in the community, and also the environmental organizations to advocate for the restoration of the North Fork.
You brought it to their attention because they probably were not even paying attention to that.
Yes. As a matter of fact, and the way we did it too was kind of a novel project. We did something called A Day in the Life of the North Fork, which was, we took a group of 7 photographers and took them on a John boat through the North Fork from sunrise to sunset. And they photographed everything that they saw. And then we had a juried competition where we picked out the best of those photographs to be part of an exhibit. And then, of course, as the neighborhood recognized that we were doing this, and we went around talking to people and telling them why we were doing this, they became involved, and then we had an event that brought together the political leadership,
That's what I was gonna
the
say.
community, on the banks of the North Fork. And one woman who had lived in that area her entire life, she said, you know what? Just before you people came here to do this, I went down to the river and I felt as if it was talking to me, because I used to play here when I was a child.
Wow.
And I had this experience of the river like almost weeping and saying to me, how could you have allowed this to happen? Because, as I said, it was really very polluted with the contamination and also the effluvia that came off of the roadways, you know, the non-point source pollution. So people had just abandoned the river because it was so unappealing.
Well, in your effort, were you able even to get the city to acknowledge or to do something about it, to acknowledge it and then do something about it to clean it up?
Well, let's just say it's not difficult for cities to acknowledge such egregious conduct. But at least they were motivated to, the city, along with the political pressure that we had brought to bear, enabled the North Fork to be included in the comprehensive Everglades restoration project. And there was money allocated for the dredging of the river. And also the city and the South Florida Water Management District agreed and cooperated to increase the flow of water into the North Fork so that it would also, you know, the flow of fresh water would also kind of like minimize the contamination. So
this is great. So
yes.
at least you're, you know, you were able to do something about it and
Yes.
get the community involved.
Get the
because it's
community
so
involved.
important for people to understand, you know, how they are affected. Because I know sometimes when the water is contaminated, their health is affected, and sometimes people around living these contaminated waters, rivers, they get pretty sick.
And that's an interesting point, because before the river became so contaminated, at the point when it was the lifeblood of the community, the people remembered how many people used to fish in the water, and that was their actual sustenance. That the people fished for food, the children swam in the water and had all of the benefits of outdoor activity and the exposure to nature. And all of that was suddenly withdrawn from them as the water became more and more contaminated. And it's so funny, when people have things taken away from them more and more, they get accustomed to it, and after a while it's just like, oh my God, we're just going to exist in this little corridor. But as we came and opened it back up to them and brought their memory back to the fact that there had been something so much bigger, so much more desirable, they were really inspired to get involved with changing the future for their river.
Wonderful. I'm glad that you touch on the fact that in these rivers, sometimes people, without knowing, they fish, they swim in it. So what we'll do, I'm going to go to Joey, because Joey knows a lot about the canals in Miami. In Miami-Dade County, there's a lot of canals and a lot of contaminants, because actually, I believe from what I personally can see, there's a lot of canals near homes. So there's probably a lot of contaminants around the canal. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, absolutely. Just to be more precise, we have close over 2,000 miles of canals throughout South Florida, and Miami-Dade County has a lot of them, and they're all enumerated by the letter C, like C100, C4, etc. Most of the canals start from the beginning. It starts from the watershed, and of course from Orlando down to the Lake Okeechobee, and from there they separated on different ways and split somehow in central South Florida. We're talking about in South Florida, at the end of each canal there are structures. Now, speaking of canals being contaminated, yes they are, because first of all, as they get out of Lake Okeechobee, they do run through what we call a water conservation area, where they go through some process to take out some chemicals such as the phosphorus and others. But once it gets down, it's starting to hit the urban areas. Then we have what we call the runoffs, people dumping, people using even canals for their little dumpster, which is really, really disgusting.
Yeah, which is one of the things I'm going to ask you later, because I know people actually dump things in there.
Yeah.
But it is very polluted. This week alone, I went for a walk and by a canal, and I was aware, like, oh my God, they are so polluted. So I could actually see on the surface. So
the thing that sometimes I would witness the variety, a plethora of, I can't even imagine. I can't even.
What is the most common contaminants that, let's say, that you find
It
in
would
the water?
be from trash. It would be from medication. It would be from metals and cans, and it would be from shopping carts. Shopping carts. They would find even automobiles after being stolen. They would dump them in the canal sometimes. I can go further as dead bodies as well.
Yikes.
Oh my God,
from
this
human-
is
Yes, and dogs, cats, animals as well.
And then I wanted to add one other thing, which is not so visible, but as we burn trash, incinerate trash, as we burn coal for power plants, all of those things spew fumes and particulate matter into the air, and then that settles out eventually, and that also will be found in our rivers and streams and canals.
Absolutely.
And some of that will sink right to the sediment. Some of it stays and sort of moves through, but just to keep in mind that there's that, what people call air deposition
that also
component
would
as
settle
well.
on the water.
Yep.
Well, we'll come back more to talk more about the canals, but since we were talking about the fishes, as with Audrey's story, like I said, there's a lot of danger where in the contaminated rivers and lakes where people want to fish, and some of them even swim. I believe in the North Fork of the New River, people have swum there as well, and swimming and fishing. So the question is, how safe, what level of how safe are the fish to eat? What level of contamination is okay for the human body to consume, Martha?
That is just one of those questions that there's no one-word answer for.
Okay.
Safe is really on a continuum. And we can test water, we can test sediment, we can test fish tissue, and they can give us some information, and then it's really up to people to decide, I'm willing to take that risk or I'm not. The same way that people make a decision about what junk food they eat or whether they smoke or not, whether they drive over the speed limit or not.
So once they're
So-
given the information, is up to them.
So I think it's really important for all of us to take a little time to absorb some of that information and understand it. And one of the visuals that I brought with me is this chart of biomagnification, and it really looks at how contaminants accumulate. So what is in the river ends up in the riverbed, and the small animals, the little critters there, consume it becomes part of the food chain, and it works its way up, so that when we do fish and eat fish from a contaminated river, we're getting an increasingly highly concentrated amount. Okay, it's because that fish doesn't just eat one insect or smaller aquatic animal in its lifetime, right? It's doing that throughout its years and its days of taking in food. So
Wow.
pregnant women really need to be careful.
Okay.
They're,
They're more vulnerable.
they're more vulnerable. Children are vulnerable because they're still developing, and you don't want your brain and your nervous system to be exposed to contaminants like mercury and lead that can interfere in that development process.
Especially lead with children. Well, you know, as you know, Martha, I eat mostly fish. And now I have to be careful. I guess you have to be careful where you get your fish from. But I'm just saying, especially in these hard economic times, a lot of people, you know, they choose to go fishing for themselves, so to help with, you know, with their food. So, you know, so that's pretty good.
Right. And the other thing I brought with me to talk about are sediment test results. And I don't know if you've ever seen them, but before we look at them, let me just tell you a little bit about the scenario. So similarly to the New River story that Audrey told, there's a small town in New England where a number of neighbors lived next to a pond, and there was a junkyard operating right in their midst and along this pond. And the neighbors were rightfully concerned. He was bringing in old cars, and so those have fuel in their tanks and who knows what for their air conditioning fluid. I had something like 1 million tires, so whatever that's picked up from the roadway, old contaminants from gasoline, all of this stuff, and there is a map of this that we can show viewers. So they wanted to know, well, was the pond safe for their kids to be wading in, fishing in, playing in, swimming in? And again, this is sort of part of our communal heritage and our right as people who live on this earth.
Yeah, to enjoy your pond and rivers.
Right.
Yeah.
So they did get test results, and the test results come back in terms of milligrams per kilogram. So do you have a good sense of what a kilogram weighs?
Not really, Martha. I know you're going to tell me or demonstrate. She brings.
I brought you a bag of soil, and this is mostly potting soil, just a little bit of soil from Florida.
From Florida, so I'm glad it's from Florida, Martha.
Yeah.
You didn't bring this all the way from Boston.
Right. A kilogram is about, it's a little over 2 pounds.
Okay.
So if you buy a 2-pound bag of onions, you could think of it like that. But give that a heave so that you have a sense of it.
Okay.
And then I also brought you a gram for comparison. So when we look at the the contaminants, we don't want to, most of them we don't want in concentrations of as much as a gram per kilogram. We're looking at a milligram, so 1,000th of this package. And some contaminants are so harmful that we really need to be counting them in parts per billion. So 1/1,000,000th of this or 1/1,000,000,000th of this.
It's very, very harmful to our health. But talking about that, I know, Audrey, you talked to us about the Nog Fault of the New River, but there is a friend of ours, there's a little story about them living near contaminated water, and she did get very sick.
Yes, well, the story you're referring to is just north of the North Fork.
Oh, really?
Yes, there was a lake called Rock Pit Lake where it was juxtaposed next to the Superfund site, where they buried trash and burned trash for a number of years. And then people along that lake, Rock Creek Lake, were actually using the water to water their vegetables and their fruits because they had no idea of the toxic burden of the water. And one of the most poignant and painful things I ever experienced was, when it came to the attention of the people in the community that that water that they've been using was contaminated. And this lady, I remember her vividly, she was crying and she said, all of those years that I was so carefully, raising my own tomatoes and my grapefruit, and I was using that water, and I did not realize that I was feeding my family, contamination. I was using contaminated water to feed my family. And her son, very young son, he was in the military, as a matter of fact, and he also used to swim in Rock Pit Lake as a kid.
Wow.
And suddenly he just developed cancer behind his breastbone, I believe, and in a very short time he was dead. And so when the community got information about the connection between the Superfund site, the contaminated lake, and what they were growing in their yards and what they were experiencing as a result of the contaminated water being used on their lawns and their wells, oh my God, it was really a wailing on gnashing of teeth. And the people were like, I cannot believe that my government would not would allow something like this to happen and not tell me. But in my experience, I have found that there are so many negative impacts that can accrue and build up in communities. But if communities don't have the power and the money and the clout, or at least advocates, and I so commend what you're doing as an advocate, because you would give a community a tool to at least identify or gauge, what they're exposed to.
Yeah, because that's what the first step is, to really acknowledge and be aware that the danger is there.
Yes.
And this community was, they were oblivious. They didn't know,
Well, what
that
we
it
have
was
going for us is
there.
this ability to talk to each other.
Yes.
And in this small community, it was really to moms, starting out talking to each other and then walking around their neighborhood. And they did call on Toxics Action Center, one of our partners that serves New England. And together they organized and they requested these test results. They requested that the EPA come out. And I just want to take a little minute to look at that chart. It's a little off-putting, I think, for people at first when they just see a whole bunch of numbers and codes, SD, R01, what is it all about? But if you just slow yourself down and talk it aloud, you'll see there's a sample number. So that's just telling you the identity, the name of any particular sample. It tells you at what depth the sample was taken. So when they go digging in the river or in the soil, they might take it from 6 inches, they might take it from 12 inches deep. They might go deeper to see what's going on. And then you might see metals, you might see VOCs, you might see PCBs. Some of these have been outlawed, right, since the 70s, but they persist. And then you'll be able to look at what the result was, and you'll see whether that result is being reported in milligrams per kilogram or micrograms per kilogram. And the final thing that I just wanted to point out about the chart is all the way on the right, you get to see what they call the squirts. I just love that name. But what it refers to is screening levels that the government has said. It's actually from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And they're looking at when will you see an effect on aquatic organisms. That's not a legally enforceable standard. It's not telling you anything about human health. But it is telling you at a certain level you can have a contaminant like mercury or zinc or lead, and you won't see any change or distress or mutation. But at a certain level, you will start to see that. And so this, when they've set a level, then you can do some comparison and you can see, oh, we're under that level, or oh, we're 10 or 20 times over.
Yeah, because I know in Dade County, because I went to one of the meetings where they were discussing that specifically, and you know we have a lot of alligators here, and the guest was speaking about how the alligator system was changing, you know, from female to male and things like that. Yeah, when I heard that, I was like,
effects of
is it
the
real? And I found
reproduction
out later
system.
on that it is. It's changing. By them being in the water, drinking this contaminated water, is changing their system completely. But with that, Joey, how often do they test these canals?
They test them many times a day, especially during storm events or during rain events. They're tested all the time. I think it would be a more or less a county issue. But on the side of, for example, the state, with the South Florida Water Management District, they do have this area south of Lake Okeechobee where they do some water testing coming from Lake Okeechobee for phosphorus. And one of the vegetation that kind of identifies some of the phosphorus would be the cattail. I don't know, they look like the sawgrass, but they're cattail. Once you have cattail in an area, it means that you have some level of phosphorus in that area because that's what they feed upon. So that's that's on the big picture for the state. Now going down to the contaminants in our community, in the city, the county would do that every now and then. They do have the Department of Environmental Management, DERM, that would be most like the person or the staff or the entity that would do it for the entire community. Sometimes I think they have a contract at times with the state to do it for the state
To do the
at
testing.
that level, to do the testing.
testing.
But it's done every now and, not every now and then, but every so often. I even heard that sometimes there's a 24-hour deal where every 8 hours there's a shift that goes and tests the water. Information is coming every now and then, every moment. And in the state portion of things, there's a data we call it, that they used to call a DB Hydro. Maybe we can go through the DB Hydro. I don't know if it's online to the public or not. It's public information. I'm not sure at this point because they were organizing it. So in a case like that, we would have to contact the state over
Because
the county.
the canal system in Miami-Dade County is just so extensive and everything is interconnected. So that's just
Correct.
a big job to make sure that it is, you know,
Correct.
tested and safe. Because, but my question to any of you here on the table, do we have to have physical contact really all the time with the water for it to affect our health? So I don't know if any of you want to answer that, you know, because I know we swim in the water, we eat the fish, but just by being near these contaminated waters, especially these canals, can it really affect
I guess
us
it
or-
makes sense that if the canal is really contaminated at a certain level, we can't have contact with certain water. For example, where there are some areas where the sewage would break out and there's a canal nearby. I mean, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to tell you that you can't go in there yet because we have sewage in the water, and a lot of things can happen to your skin and your health. So that's one of the issues that we may want to discuss in a future date when we have those breakouts of water sewage near the canals and also towards the ocean, going to the beach, certain areas.
A lot of the. Did you have something to say?
Yes. I wanted to say that I look at things quite holistically. So I believe that, you know, it's often said that water is the lifeblood of a community.
Yes.
So if you live in proximity to a waterway that's contaminated, you have to appreciate that it must have some effect on your well-being, even if it's just a matter of aesthetic perception. You know, I mean, I'd much rather see a clean body of water than a dirty, contaminated body. And, you know, the whole focus of our business has been to raise community engagement in taking care of the environment. And so I always want to give people something to do. So if the public should be empowered. If you are living near a body of water that's contaminated, then you might feel a desire to try to do something about it because it's not just you, it's your children, it's your community, etc. So the first thing that I encourage people to do is organize. You know, you might want to just get together with your homeowners group or some kind of communities group, and you have to make some kind of an appeal and approach to the people who operate the canals, whether it's in a city,
Yes.
county, or local level. You have to make them aware. Look, I am aware that this is contaminated in my neighborhood, and I want to know what are the consequences to me, and what can you do to clean it up, and how can we as a neighborhood help you? Because we're always looking not just to manage it, but actually to change things. And of course, you, I imagine, would be, and your organization, would be helpful in helping people do that.
Just to allude to what you were saying, there are events that we have every year. You may be familiar with them, the Little River Cleanup, for example. We would take kids from schools. They would even use it as community service, where we have some organization that have little boats or canoes that they would put on the river, the Little River, close on the eastern part of Miami-Dade County, and we would go and pick up all the trash that's in the water. Everybody, of course, would have gloves and pick up the trash in the water.
Make sure they're safe.
All the kids, and they're all safe, and they all have leaders in each canoes. We would have dozens of canoes all over Little River, all the way to I-95 and back towards the structure and picking up trash. It's a fun day, and it's a good way to start.
Yeah, and it's a hands-on, so they can really get close and understand.
Absolutely.
But
I want to also weigh in
go
on
ahead.
the first question before we leave that. So I think Audrey made a number of good points about how people were exposed to water, and just know that their skin contact that can be a factor. There's eating, drinking it directly. There's also watering your garden, and some plants will take up contamination much more readily than others. Sometimes when they do a site remediation, they actually use certain plants because of that. They'll lift those contaminants out of the soil. And what am I missing? Breathing. So if you're around something that has actually got an odor, fume, smell, you notice yourself coughing, headaches, that kind of thing, those are indications that you may be experiencing
From what I
some
understand,
negative
even
health
lead,
effect.
even lead sometime in the air, you can be contaminated by doing that. So
Right, but contact is key, and you can't, I mean, it's worth asking a question, but not jumping to a conclusion about how the environment is affecting your health. There's a lot of different factors.
that makes a lot of sense. We don't have a lot of time, but I have one more question for you, because if somebody is I don't want to say this word cut, but if you find people actually on purpose dumping these contaminants or trash in the canals, do they get fined, or is there a system in place for that, or what have you found?
We have many agencies, law enforcement agencies, and of course some of the environmental agencies. They're trying to get together with the municipalities, because a lot of our canals go through our municipalities, and that's where it occurs. For example, we have the South Dade area, we have the Homestead area, Pinecrest, all that area. They would like to have some sort of consortium where you have, for example, their police department. We would have the guys who take care of the coastal areas, water management. Well, water management is not really an enforcement agency, but they're trying to do that. There's really no law.
In place right now.
In place right now. What we can do is, what you can do is report
if you see as a citizen, because now you know it's affecting you.
Do a citizen report or a citizen call. Hey, just like you do for criminals, you know, it's a crime zone. You do it also for a dumping watch.
We share the water. It's our water.
Yeah, it's our water. Yeah. And of course, you do some outreach on that. There's a lot of outreach that needs to be done on that issue.
Yeah, I was very.
River Network is also a great source for information, and all of what goes into rivers, lakes, and streams from businesses has to be reported. And there's permits, and then there's disclosure that they do on a regular basis to show that they are in compliance with the number of times they test and report.
And with the economy, you would have to have staff to be on that.
To do that.
On the canals every day to make sure that it's not being done.
Well, that's something that we encourage that it can be done, but we'll have that website on the credits, so you can write down that website so you can get more information. We are almost out of time, and it's great when you're having fun, but also learning a lot. I learned so much from all of you here, and I want to thank you all for being a guest on EocAlert.
So our last plea for people to take action, stand up, request, demand.
It's your life.
It's really our inheritance, and for us to take care of.
And we
hope that it's being taken care of.
Yeah, and we hope we have given the audience enough information to take action and to make sure that yourself and your family are safe, especially for future generations. Thank you for watching. This was Nadine Patrice. See you next time on EocAlert.